Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. My name is Daryl Lim. I serve as the H. Laddie Montag Junior Chair and Associate Dean for Research and Innovation at the Law School. This series offers an opportunity to glean insights from top leaders. In each episode, we invite leaders to reflect on their journeys and share the skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. My guest today is Vilas Dhar, President of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, a billion-dollar global philanthropy focused on advancing AI and data solutions for good. Vilas brings a unique mix of experience to this role. He's trained as a computer scientist, a lawyer, and a public policy thinker, and he's worked across sectors from AI research and social impact startups to international governance bodies. He's also a member of the UN uh, High-Level Advisory Board on AI, a young global leader with the World Economic Forum, and serves on multiple nonprofit and foundation boards, including AccessLex and the Christensen Fund. In today's conversation, we'll talk about vision, leadership, and the role of philanthropy in shaping the digital future. From rethinking the social contract to rebuilding institutions that can lead with both innovation and integrity. Vilas, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Daryl, good morning, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I sometimes just like to say I'm a small town boy who's trying to do something good in this world, and that's usually enough, but you're very kind.
Which small town did you come from?
You know, I grew up about 2 hours south of Chicago, right in the middle of the United States, in a town called Champaign, Illinois. We literally had cornfields out behind my house. It was great.
So tell us about your journey. You're a computer scientist, you're a lawyer, and these two disciplines don't naturally intersect. So how did you come into each one, and how did you see the connection between the two?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I'll disagree with you just to begin from a place of productive and constructive disagreement. I think these two disciplines are actually tightly interlinked, and the fact that we don't often explore that is maybe a problem. But let me answer your question. I was very lucky. I mentioned to you where I grew up, and I sometimes think about where I grew up in the context of geography, right? These rolling plains in the middle of Illinois, where we had one university and then 100 miles of fields around us. But I also think about timelines and places of human history. I grew up in rural Illinois in the 80s, but I also grew up visiting my family in rural India at the same time, a place where my family often lived in environments that almost felt pre-industrial or outside of the technological revolution. Houses with no power or running water, with outhouses, and with one telephone maybe for an entire village or even a group of villages. And then I also grew up in a way that felt like the future. I grew up very close to the National Center for Supercomputing, one of the 5 sites in the United States that had this amazing capacity for building and envisioning a technological future. I tell you this because in many ways it's shaped almost every decision I've ever made in my life. On one side, an incredible optimism and a hope about what technology makes possible for us as humans when we bring our inspiration, our creativity, our innovative engines to build things that transform our relationship to the world around us. And yet that optimism balanced by a realization that unless we really understand the systems of power, unless we understand how we make decisions together as communities, unless we actually have a commitment to making technology work for people, what we're left with is a world where technology accrues to the few and the many are left outside and behind. So that's a very long way of saying, I suppose, a very short answer. I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be a master of our technological tools. I studied engineering, I studied computer science and bioengineering, as you said. I was very immersed in early research about AI. I wanted to really think about how we might transform the human condition through the use of these tools. And after spending, a very early part of my life, but a very intense part of my life doing that, I came to a very easy realization. I could spend my life building more tools on a flywheel that always felt like we were chasing innovation in tech, or I could also learn the toolkit that would let me figure out how to take these tools and make them accessible to the world. And so for me, that was understanding the systems of power through the practice of law.
So let's talk about power and AI.
Mm.
How should we think about power in the context of AI? I mean, who holds it, who's left out, and who needs to be centered?
Yeah. I think in many ways it's the perfect microcosm or the perfect sandbox to understand power is to understand what's happened with AI. In many ways, because it's moving so quickly and because it's not filtered through political layers or the softening sometimes of time, we're seeing what happens when you have a set of prerequisites that are fundamentally not grounded in dignity and justice. And what happens? Let me tell you what I mean. On one side, we have the needs of building AI at scale that are so immediate and material, the need for capital, the need for the aggregation of technology talent, the need for fundamental resources like power and water. And because those things are so hyper concentrated, we see that those who are able to build the frontier of AI are similarly concentrated in their structures and their power. There are maybe a handful of companies in the world today that have really credible frontier AI models. And if you look outside of the US, maybe we might add 10 or 15 more to the list. But a very small set of companies with a relatively small workforce that are making decisions that shape how AI will affect billions of lives. This is the fundamental construct of how power is created, right? We take all of the aggregation of these hyper concentrated resources, we put them in the hands of the few, and almost by dint of inertia, we also say to them, we now give you a mandate to make these decisions for us. Now, this is an inertial analysis. This is kind of what is happening as I observe it, but by no means do I think this is inevitable. I think there are many, many, many ways in which we might step into this construction of power and say, wait, this isn't working for the rest of the world. We can talk more about the specifics, but let me give you the overall general sense that I have. In many ways, I think for the last 30 or 40 years as a society, we've looked at complex decisions about technology and taken a step back as individuals and communities and said, we'll follow the decisions that are made by the creators of the tools as they seek profits in the market, and we'll accept the consequences of what those outcomes are. We did it with the internet, the original envisioning of the World Wide Web that would be a democratic and equitable participatory marketplace that was quickly co-opted into platforms that really were rent-seeking, extractive organizations. We saw it with social media. The original sort of vision of a deeply connected, community-oriented mechanism for finding people and finding similarities quickly became well, we know what it became. With AI, we have one more bite at the apple. And the question becomes, do we want to commit to a form of participatory, decentralized, meaningful agency in an AI age?
So let's focus on one aspect of that, and that's the narrative on AI. How do you think that has shaped our understanding of policy making in ways that either concern you or excite you?
Well, I'm always excited even when I'm concerned, but I will tell you, we're living right in the middle of it now, right? So let me just take the last 5 years, recognizing that AI has been a discipline for 70 or 80 years that many of us, those of us who have been kind of deeply involved in AI have done so for 20 or 30 years. Let's take the last 5. I think I sometimes say it's almost like the stages of grief, right? That before AI entered the public sphere through ChatGPT, it was almost a space of no concern, that it really wasn't in the public discourse. There were a few bright spots, but really it wasn't in the conversation. And then all of a sudden we had this moment where the narrative shifted from the pre-GPT narrative of, Hollywood movies and sci-fi and dystopian futures to a deeply accessible, emotionally resonant version of what AI could be as people engaged with a chatbot that had human-like responses. And immediately we had this moment of, it felt like almost cultural optimism about AI. All of a sudden it became real and genuine, and we began to ascribe to it godlike capabilities that all of a sudden, because we could now type into a chatbot, we thought AI would fix everything. We very quickly were disabused of that notion, and we went instead to fear. We saw the creation of these new narratives around existential risk, the idea that AI systems would become so capable that they might displace us as humans. It almost feels like we spent 2 or 3 quarters in a collective delusion that this was the most important thing in the world. It was coupled, going back to stories of power, with a pretty significant set of financial resources. And those financial resources, coupled with the emotional resonance of this risk, informed policy making at scale. We saw it in the form of the Global AI Summit that was very famously held at Bletchley Park a few years ago, the AI Safety Summit that became about existential risk. What was absent from that conversation was the flip side of the coin, a question and a story about how we might build AI for public purpose at scale. And if I continue to go through it, and we can do so if you like, you'll see we moved from kind of a general not caring to extreme optimism, to fear, and then hopefully, as we move through all of these stages, towards a pragmatism and acceptance of what AI might be. And I think we've seen the policy arc around that follow that phase exactly as well.
Like, so you serve on the UN's high-level advisory board on AI. I know you're going to be at the UN in September, and I hear that you like to cause some good trouble. So tell us about what your hopes and assessment is on where this body is, what do you think its urgent priorities are, and where is it best positioned to make a lasting impact?
Yeah, let me give you a very hopeful start, and then I'll give you a very pragmatic analysis. The hopeful start is this. I think in many ways, as I sort of said at the top of our call, we as a society have stepped back from technology regulation. You know, here in the United States, it feels like we haven't really passed a meaningful bill around technology since 1996, right? Section 230 in the Telecommunications Act. Internationally, it feels like our institutions of multilateralism have deeply weakened and struggled to come up with new forms of engagement and collaboration. And yet, AI to me represents something quite hopeful. It becomes a place where, at least in its early days, it has created such attention, such energy, such vigor, but also a realization that issues of AI regulation have to be cross-border. They have to be global because of the reach of these technologies. The economic impacts of AI in logistics and supply chain won't be felt merely within the state borders of one country. It'll impact many. And because of that realization, I've been hopeful that this might be the seed of a new form of multilateralism, a willingness for countries that maybe often don't connect and align in their approaches might say this is a place where there's a forcing function that requires us to come together. And I think in many ways that vision has been borne out to some degree. When the Secretary General asked us to join this high-level advisory body, he gave us 3 clear mandates. He said, and this was quite in the early days of AI, he said, I want to understand the risks, because everybody's talking about the risks as we've discussed. But I want you to go beyond the risks, and I want you to think about opportunities. What would it look like to really build AI for public purpose at a global level with the collaboration and participation, not just of the countries that have deep tech capacity, but those who have significant talent, have significant demographic interests, and have a real interest in how AI might transform their economies. And third, to envision what the governance structures might be that allow that future to come to pass. The body worked for a year on a very accelerated timeline and has officially closed its work. But the results, the AI Governing AI for Humanity report, was a primary contributor also to the Global Digital Compact. And I started for you with an optimism about what might be possible. The Global Digital Compact to me is the conclusion of that, a instrument that was acceded to by many, many countries, a vast majority of them, that actually sets forward a structure and a framework for how we might think about technology regulation at scale, that calls for the establishment of an international scientific advisory body on AI, that looks for multi-stakeholder forums where we actually build best practices, that asks the question, could we build a financing mechanism to think about how we develop AI for public purpose across the global majority? There's a line of hope here. And I want to be very clear-eyed about it, right? I don't know that we've accomplished something transformative in the context of multilateral diplomacy. But in a world where we are constantly hearing that multilateral institutions are failing, Global Digital Compact stands as an example of something that is quite concrete, that's necessary, that sets a framework for a positive vision of the future, and that was done really through the traditional mechanisms of multilateralism.
So can you share with our viewers a little bit about what they can expect to happen at the UN or at the multilateral level, say in the next year or two?
Yeah, I always like questions that require me to look into a crystal ball. I can tell you that I can answer one from a personal perspective of having been in the discussions, two with a great deal of hopefulness, and third with some, let's say, real world influence pragmatism. But I'll tell you what I hope will happen. The first is I think we recognize that we still lack a very rich and deep information ecosystem around what AI's effects will be. There are a few of us that for many, many years have provided projections and thoughts about what it might look like, many of which have borne true. But now as we go into the granularity of the application of AI and how it'll affect vulnerability across the planet, we need significantly more inputs. We need thinkers and institutions that are able to carry water on that question. So the first thing I hope will happen will be the establishment of these international forums and convenings that actually allow for the aggregation of experience-driven insight around the effects of AI. One of those I mentioned already, the Scientific Advisory Body, another which will be a forum for the sharing of best practices and regulation. The third, work with institutions like UNESCO that have created a global ethics framework for AI. And in partnership with our foundation and others have built a tool that actually allows national governments at scale to analyze their preparedness for an AI future. It's called a readiness assessment methodology. 60 plus countries have used them. And in many countries, the products of that tool have been the creation of frameworks for national legislation. So I think this is one sort of area of work that'll happen, is how do we create better forums for information creation and sharing. The second is, we know that for an AI future to work, we need broadly distributed capacity around AI. We need to actually invest in building the compute infrastructure, in training the kinds of people that can actually build these tools, and developing the community-driven use cases that let us build AI for public purpose at scale. These are questions like, how does our community understand the effects of climate change on coastal resilience? And how should we be better curating our mangroves, our cypresses, or other natural barriers? There are questions like, how do we restructure our access to frontline healthcare in extremely rural and last mile areas? And where does creating predictive models allow us to do better population health at scale? There are questions like, how do we transform our understanding of our economic structures and make sure there's more economic opportunity across the pyramid? So we need a compendium of use cases. We need an entire mechanism to be able to bring together exemplars and share them out to the world. And the last thing I'll say on this, Daryl, is you've heard the term data a million times in the context of AI. And we often talk about it as if it's some sort of commodity that feeds the oil belching monster of AI creation, right? There's something quite fundamental about data, though, that multilateralism needs to be involved in. We know that data is often collected when it has a commercial purpose. And we know that there's plenty of evidence out there that shows that the data we collect in many ways shapes the ways that we build policy and frameworks about how we respond to the environment we see. What's missing there, though, is what's the mechanism by which we collect and aggregate data about the people who are maybe not the profitable market consumers, but rather represent the majority of the world? How do we understand how data represents the lived environments that they have created and are participants in? Fundamental questions, and this is a story I often tell, so I'll give you the short version. I was in a conversation with a senior minister who mentioned to me how much data they had about subsurface mineral deposits, how the mining industry in collaboration with the government had created an incredibly rich environment to understand what the cost of extraction might be of everything from gold and cobalt and silver and copper and rare earths. And yet I asked one question that kind of stopped her in her tracks. I said, we know so much about subsurface minerals, but your country is currently in drought. Can you show me on the same map where you have safe, potable drinking water that's either at the surface level or immediately below? And as it turned out, they had almost no data on that question. In that anecdote, I think is something that demonstrates exactly why we need public policy at work in the collection of data that represents real lives around the world. We need public financing and public mechanisms to incentivize the creation of that data. And we need policy frameworks that say that if you're going to build an AI model, you need to actually affirmatively look for that kind of data and make sure that's incorporated into decision-making.
Thank you. Now let's do a little pivot and focus
Sure.
now on the second broad theme of our conversation, and that's leadership. So let's start again right from the top. Who are some of the key mentors or figures in your life that help shape your leadership style?
Well, I love that question. It's something I think about a lot. And I think leadership's a journey of lifetime learning, but it's one of those fun ones, like so much of what you do, Daryl, that has to be a virtuous cycle of experience, of learning and reflection and teaching. That's a big part of my life. I'll tell you that my views on social change have in many ways informed my views on leadership. That first of all, change and leadership very rarely is the story of one person. That it can't really be, if I am leading alone, then who am I leading and what am I leading towards? It doesn't really make sense to me. That leadership is a story of movements. It's a story of how we build collective passion and engagement. And so the first set of leaders I look to are those who have been incredible shapers of movements. Sometimes the ones who are celebrity leaders, right? Certainly the works of incredible folks that we'll all recognize the names of, the Martin Luther Kings and the Gandhis of the world. But maybe just as powerful are the unsung and unheard from heroes that organize within communities and organize within rural areas and within small towns. People who recognize that leadership is not a matter of principles that are written down or read in a book, but are about the lived virtue of actions. I think often of my grandfather, a man who had a third grade education, was born in the late 19 teens in rural India. Never had access or the opportunity for a formal education, lived a life that, to be honest with you, sounds like it's almost out of Indiana Jones or something like that, right? A number of vignettes and stories that took him from being a freedom fighter in pre-British independence India, all the way through to being a smuggler that moved gold and silk across borders, that became a lumberjack who worked in the forests and took on a personal mission around stopping illegal poaching and in many ways maybe hunting down the hunters themselves, and became a social kind of coordinator and organizer when he opened a shop in the middle of Bangalore, India in the 1960s that became the central spot. I tell you about him not because of the things he did, but because of the ways he showed what leadership was. It was a quiet way of leadership. It was a way of demonstrating through character and integrity that the things that he cared about weren't just about him, they were about the people that were around him. That when it became time for somebody in his village to raise enough money to send their daughter to school, he was the first person there to help organize that. That when there was overreach from the government or bureaucratic interventions that made people's lives worse, without any personal gain or interest, he showed up and stood shoulder to shoulder with those people. That over his life, he touched thousands or tens of thousands of lives, always with a quiet determination and a conviction that there was something good to be done in the world and that there was no reward attached to it. You did it because it was the right thing to do. And in many ways, that to me has modeled what leadership should look like in the world. It's a story of how we help each other and how we do the right thing.
Thanks. So leadership is also about learning from and pushing through challenges. What is one leadership lesson you've learned the hard way and one that you return to often?
You know, when I entered the field of philanthropy, it was a very unexpected career choice for me. I had actually, when I had exited my last company, I'd said I'd never take an operating role again. I wanted to be a scholar and academic to work on kind of big social questions at scale. But I was deeply attracted to the opportunity not of building one more in a crowded space of institutions, but to ask a more fundamental question. What would it look like to transform the very purpose of philanthropic institutions? How would we restructure what an organization does? How would we ask very hard and often uncomfortable questions about why foundations exist in the world? And without boring you with the details, let me tell you at a high level that as I went through that intellectual exercise, I realized that many of the things that I wanted to do were deeply orthogonal to the orthodoxy of thinking about what an institution like this should look like. That leadership here wasn't merely about doing one more or iterating to make it better, but to put a flag in the sand and say, there are some fundamental assumptions here that we need to test in very uncomfortable ways. And as you might imagine, that didn't make me very popular at cocktail parties for a little while, right? But I think one of the things that I've learned about leadership is when you have a moral conviction, when you have a sense that something better is possible and it requires you to transform assumptions, there's a path to accomplish that that requires deep courage, and it often can be quite isolating. And I don't mean that at a personal level. I've been deeply grateful in my life to be surrounded by incredible supporters and moral partners, but it does put you outside of the space of where traditional thinking is. And when that happens, you're often faced with a very specific question. Do I have enough confidence in my view of what this transformative moment is that I'm willing to head entirely apart from the pack? That I'm willing to espouse these ideas with clarity and with conviction, even when it's unpopular, even when it provokes and creates almost an immune response, right? To take that outlier and to quiet it. And to recognize that you have to be in it for the long haul. That merely to be an activist or somebody who says, I'm going to find the critique without providing a solution and acting with the conviction to deliver against it doesn't get you to an outcome. I think about this all the time when I mentor young people today. And so often our society is very much structured to say, take your amazing generative creative spirit and funnel it into a particular path or structure. Anything that doesn't fit should be left behind. And even in the ways that we built our talent pipeline here at the foundation, or the ways I think about mentoring graduate students and young people across the country, I think the biggest piece of advice I have for them is to recognize that you are, in your many faceted beauties, an amazing and incredible actor in this world. There's no reason for you to leave any of that behind simply to fit within a job or a career. In fact, you can be quite successful when you bring that in and you what's expected by showing what you're capable of.
Thanks. Let's talk about the foundation, and I will start with your transition into the foundation. How did they attract you to join, to helm this foundation? And just in a nutshell, for folks who are not familiar with the work of your foundation, what does your foundation do?
Sure, I'd love to share. So, as I've sort of shared with you, my career has taken me down a number of different paths, as a technologist, as a lawyer, as a CEO, as an entrepreneur. But about now 8 years ago, I was at Harvard University, and I was acting as the fellow on social change. And in my research, one of the things I was really deeply interested in was, having spent time in the private sector and having built some successful organizations, I was trying to find the analog in the public sector. Where were those centers of focusing energy, whether because of the aggregation of capital, but more interestingly to me, always the aggregation of ideas, capable of creating a large scale change in how we thought about fundamental assumptions. And I began to think about philanthropy. I learned some disconcerting numbers and facts, which I'm happy to share with you. I took a close look at a question, and I'll give you a version of it. I would ask people often in town halls across the country, to just participate in an exercise. And the question I would ask is, how much do you think institutional philanthropy in America spent in 2020 to create social change? I'll spare you the question, but you get a lot of numbers back, and people didn't really have a very good sense. I don't know if you want to venture a guess. It's okay.
Too
I can
big.
give you, well, how much?
Too big. Well, I have no idea, but I
Yeah, yeah.
suppose you got to start at $1 billion.
Well, let me give you a different frame, and this is often what I would do with groups. Is like, set aside philanthropy. It's a world that doesn't feel so familiar to many Americans, which to me itself is a problem. But let's ask a different question. I think many would agree that technology has transformed the American landscape, and the primary driver of that has been venture capital. If you ask the same question, how much do you think venture capital has funded in America in a given year? I'll tell you the number. Around 2020, that number was somewhere between 100 and 120 billion dollars. It's a significant amount of capital. And with that, we have seen over many years the creation of every piece of technological infrastructure that you and I have the ability to enjoy. Okay, so take that as your baseline, right? The impact of venture capital, the amount of money spent. And then we return to our question. If you think about institutional philanthropy at scale and ask the same question, how much money has been spent and how much impact has been created? Well, let's start with the second half of that question. I think many people would say, to me, it's not incredibly apparent what philanthropy has done. Often that work feels like it happens at a distance. It's often not super transformative. It's direct relief. But if you take that assumption, then you come back to the foundational question, how much do you think they've spent? Do you want to change your guess?
Well, I'll stick to $1 billion because that's where the foundation is. I think that's a good place to start.
It's a good thought process, but I will tell you the answer is significantly more. And the answer is actually institutional philanthropy in similar years spends about as much as venture capital does, 100 to 120 billion dollars. That is an incredible amount of resources that are held in tax advantage institutions that have nearly $4 or $5 trillion in assets, depending on the year you're looking at. That's not money that's not guided by democratic participatory decision making, but often happens inside of institutions with relatively opaque processes. So why do I share all this with you? Well, it strikes me that if we believe that institutions need to exist that solve market problems, that need to supplement the work of governments, that we invest trillions of dollars in them, then I think we have a right as citizens to also ask quite a lot from them, to hold them accountable for outcomes, to ask questions about how they're structured and how they're created and what they've done for us. This is where I started from. And you asked the question, kind of, how did I get involved with the foundation? This is the work I was doing at the Harvard Kennedy School. And it wasn't a broad-based critique of philanthropy. Many others were doing that because it was, I think, in vogue in some ways. I had a more nuanced version of it, which was not to say these institutions shouldn't exist, but rather they should be better. And here are the ways they should. And because of that work, I was approached and joined actually the boards of several large philanthropies. And I really want to acknowledge them for their courage and willingness to really bring somebody on in a governance capacity that was essentially saying, hey, we need to rethink how we govern these institutions. It's a little quick bit of a side note, but it's something that in my many years in the private sector, I've very rarely seen institutions that were so willing to take a risk on governance in that way. And so I want to acknowledge the philanthropic sector for being willing to do so. I think in a different conversation, you and I might have a discussion of why I think private companies should actually be willing to take more risks in this space, but for another time. Long story short, from there, I joined the boards and the governance function of a few institutions. One of them was a new institution that had really just been created, the legacy of Patrick McGovern, who was a fascinating character, was a CEO in kind of all of the ways that a CEO meant something in the latter half of the 20th century, built a global publishing firm, had a core mission, which was this idea that if we could democratize access to information and knowledge about what was happening in computing, we'd create this amazing ecosystem of innovation from people all across the planet, from Silicon Valley, certainly, but also from places where he invested deeply, like India and Vietnam and China and others. When he passed away, he left his estate to a foundation and asked us to do good with it. And the family asked me to join the board. And that began a long journey, but the major milestones were a few years into it. The board asked me to join as CEO, and it's ever since been an incredible kind of approach and practice. You asked me to share a little bit about the foundation does. In the very early days of planning, I think we recognized one very key description of what was happening in the world around us. That for a number of decades, we had invested so deeply in the innovation of technology, and we had neglected and abandoned the question of innovation in our social systems, our institutions, our mechanisms of dealing with the effects of it. And to me, this felt like the perfect place for where a philanthropic institution needed to step in. How can we bridge the gap between what our technologies were capable of and how we were governing them and leading them to public outcome? And that's really what we do. We do a handful of things. We fund significant amounts of infrastructure, including new institutions, as well as pilots and projects that bring AI to life and make them usable for public purpose. We support policymakers at local, regional, national, and international levels to understand what's happening in the world of AI and how they might directly address it. I spent a lot of time in what Roberto Unger called institutional imagination, thinking about what our future might look like over 10, 20, or 30 years, and asking the question, what do we need to do today to ensure that future is something that supports all of humanity? And we build our own technology tools at scale. I think we represent an institution that is almost a technology company owned by a public purpose entity. It means that we can build technologies that aren't built for profit, but rather are built for purpose.
Wonderful. And looking back at your term as president so far, what are some of the things that you're proudest of?
Oh, thank you. That's such a great question. It's a question. I recently got to spend some time with my team in our summit, and rather than the things that I'm proud of, I asked them what they're proud of, and I want to share with you some of those answers. It was incredible. The first is, we started our conversation with a question. One of the team members asked me, "What's your vision of what transformative change looks like?" And I said, to me, there are three things that are relevant when you think about transformative change. The first is having the capacity to, at both an intellectual and a descriptive level, define what a vision of transformative futures looks like. To be able to put into words intuitions that we might have about what it looks like when AI changes the economic assumptions undergirding our society, when it creates new and powerful mechanisms for advancing human rights, for thinking about participatory and democratic structures, to be able to name that vision. But we can often name a vision and it lands with a thud. The second step is to actually validate that vision is possible and achievable, to do it in small scale, but to do it with those exemplar best cases that allow you to incite and build the movement. And the third part of this three-part process is to name a vision, to demonstrate its viability, and then to build the tooling, the support, the infrastructure, the ecosystem that lets other people join in that mission and turn it from one to many. I share that with you because I think in many ways that's what the team said we were most proud of, was in this world where AI, to me, is a technology, not an outcome, but is enabling a number of meaningful outcomes, we have built a cohesive vision of what that good future looks like. One that's human-centered, one that allows for a certain set of values and principles that represent the interests of every person on the planet to be centered in its creation. That lets everybody participate not just in the use of new tools, but in the creation of them, and therefore in the economic benefits that come from their use. We validated it at scale. I think as of last year, we put $500 million of investment into the world. The money isn't the impact. The impact comes from the incredible things that have been enabled because of it. All of these use cases, and I'm happy to tell you about hundreds more in a different conversation, that show what happens when communities bring their deep knowledge of a problem set and then are empowered by these new tools to build solutions that really matter. And then finally, our commitment to turning this into shared practice. We work closely with major funders, many of them recognizable names, as well as nonprofits across the world to equip, build, and deliver a new kind of capacity for AI-enabled social change at scale. I think that's what we're most proud of, is that in, really in 5 years, we have been able to validate that this kind of challenge is possible. And in doing so, set the frame for a new kind of institution, one that merges the traditional strengths of philanthropy and capital access and thinking about programmatic work, but ties it also to the ability to be not just responsive, but visionary about the kind of change needed in the world, to harness and use technological tools at the same level that the leading AI companies do, and to tie it all into policy frameworks in a way that lets us make sure that these benefits accrue to billions of people.
Thanks. You think a lot about board governance, and you serve on and work on several boards, the Christensen Fund, AccessLex. From where you stand, what defines effective board governance today, especially in mission-driven and tech-adjacent organizations like yours?
It's a great question. I should clarify, I've left the Christensen board several years ago, but it's an incredible organization that's had a transformative story. But in its place, I've joined several others. So let me tell you, I think board governance often gets put into one of two boxes. Either the very, I hate to use the word, but boring, static kind of mechanism of risk assessment and controls, or sometimes this idea of boards as the stewards of organizations in crisis. And too often, those are the two narratives that are told. I think there's a third and much more important narrative that lives much more quietly, which is the idea of a set of people who join together with management to set meaningful long-term visions, not just for the company, but for its employees, for its customers, for the larger stakeholder community, and in many ways are responsible for defining what our vision is of economic systems at scale. Now, I spend a lot of time with organizations that focus on board governance. I teach extensively in the space, and I know that what I've said to you is something that can be a little bit unsettling. If you look at the traditional stories of board governance, what you will hear is incredibly robust education about governance in the form of risk, of auditing, of making sure that you are managing practices to be in compliance, of making sure that you're not outside of your fiduciary responsibilities. And yet I come back to the core thesis. The greatest organizations in the world have not been built because they had boards that controlled for downside, but because they were visionary about upside. I think this is something I try to bring to every board that I'm on, is this fundamental question: do we have such faith and confidence in our team, in our management, in our products, in our interventions in the world, that we're willing to step beyond how do we just make sure we don't get in trouble, and ask instead, how do we reshape the world in a way that leads to better outcomes for more people? That's a different kind of process. It's a process of facilitated conversation, of strategic discussion, of what my wife, who is a behavioral economist, calls productive disagreement, of being able to live in the discomfort of cognitive friction and ask the question, how do we come through this with a more robust vision of what the future looks like?
Thank you. So as we wrap up, I do want to invite you to reflect on a couple of things, but also to talk to especially our younger listeners and viewers about themselves. So I'll give you a chance to speak to them in a moment. But before that, if you look back at the arc of your professional and indeed your personal life, what connects the dots for you?
It's a great framing. I'll tell you, it's always been very clear to me that there are two elements at play. The first is the connect the dots piece, what you've just described, which to me is mostly about a moral grounding. It's about a set of convictions. And again, I sort of share this with you at the top of the call, but it's important to rename it an optimism and a hopefulness that better is possible. And the driving frustration that says, if better is possible, why are we content with what we have now? To take that and map that to questions about dignity, about participation and access, about why we're okay with vulnerability as it exists in the world today. To recognize that we have access to incredible tools and to know that we have a moral responsibility to use them well. This describes, I think, everything I've done in my life. These are the drivers that bring me into this work, to recognize that we can do this together in movements that build collective capacity and change the world for the better. But the second part of this is, I have to acknowledge, with that incredibly firm foundation, I have often felt that the best approach is to be quite loose and liberal in assessing the opportunities that come. To think that I had some kind of plan when I was 16 and graduating, from my first college degree, that I would know what the rest of my life looked like, would be an act of incredible hubris. Instead, what I think I've dealt with, and this might come to the advice that I want to give to young people, is to recognize that you might have a deeply held set of convictions and intentions, and you need to deal with the world as it comes to you. To be opportunistic, to recognize that there will be things that come that you've never thought that you might be capable of doing, but by jumping deeply into them, by immersing yourself in the possibility, you find that you can be more and that you have more to contribute than you ever thought.
Well, thank you. Last word to you, Vilas. What
Yeah,
final thought or a kernel of wisdom would you like to leave with our viewers?
thanks, Daryl. And in this conversation, I feel like we've gone through a few different acts, and I absolutely love that. I want to try to tie them together in one story for particularly the young people who might watch this. And I think it's a story about path dependency. It's a story about how, in many ways, our society says to us, be creative, be imaginative, be generative in your education, and then come out and slot yourself into a set of boxes and rules that we have defined for you. I think it's one of the worst things that we do as a society, is to at some point say, you have to begin to trim the most imaginative and creative parts of your life so that you can find a place within a hierarchy. I think in the world of AI, where we are seeing this potential, this possibility of a economic cornucopia, of a possibility of restructuring systems of power, what we need more than ever are generative, imaginative thinkers, are people who say, I reject the premise of the past, except as it applies to my best version of the future. And I think that if we created an enabling environment through our academic institutions, through our law schools, through our professional schools, and through our creative processes, where we said to everyone, this is a moment that requires more of all of us. It no longer requires habits and patterns and customs. It requires us to believe that better is possible. We might be able to come together to create something truly magical in terms of a AI-enabled but deeply human-centered future.
Oh, Vilas, first of all, thank you for your time and for sharing your thoughts so generously, but also more broadly, thank you for the work that you do at the foundation and for the benefit of all of us.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you.